I'm sure that the sport that the majority of you are aware of is Pokemon battling. It's such a phenomenon around the world that every young kid dreams of eventually taking on the Gym Badge Challenge and then taking their team of highly trained Pokemon to the Pokemon League of their region. There are entire industries dedicated to handling that sport. I'm talking video games, books, shows, documentaries, all about Pokemon battling. And it's even healthy for the Pokemon to do, as Pokemon, when taking a wide look at the whole of the Pokemon world, are very competitive. But aside from that, there are also many smaller and more niche sports around the world. Fighting Pokemon competitions, Pokemon contests, and one that is entirely centered around the subject of this guide, Ryhorn racing. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Pokemon Care Guides, where we go through how you would raise and care for different Pokemon species in your own home. Today, we'll be talking about the armor-plated, charging Pokemon Ryhorn and its evolutions Rhydon and Rhyperior. Ryhorn is a quadrupedal Pokemon with squat legs and a thick, wide-set body. It is entirely covered in stone plates that give it an armored look. Its head is triangular in shape, with a horn over its nose which is used to crash its way through any obstacle in its way. Its eyes are small relatively for its body and placed more forward on its head, and there is a ridge that runs along its spine that sticks up in the air. Ryhorn is fairly short, only standing about 3 feet and 3 inches tall, or 1 meter, but weighing an incredible 253.5 pounds, or 115 kilos. That's pretty big for a first stage evolution, and they only get bigger when they evolve into a Rhydon. Rhydon become bipedal, which explains why they are now 6 foot 3 inches, or 1.9 meters. Interestingly enough though, they don't get too much heavier, now only being 264.5 pounds, or 120 kilos. They're still covered in stone armor plates, though it's much smoother on Rhydon than it is on Ryhorn. Its belly is now covered in tan armor plates as well, and its head is completely changed from how it was as a Ryhorn. It now has large ears on the top of its head, its mouth is now much larger, and the horn that was before part of the armor plating now is separate from the armor and is able to spin like a drill. As well, Rhydon has a long tail that it mostly uses to counterbalance its heavy front end. Now, if this was a couple decades ago, then that's where the evolutionary stages would end. In nature, they only reach the second stage. But, years ago, scientists discovered an odd genetic abnormality in the Ryhorn line, and specifically in Rhydon, along with a few other species. They developed items that, when these Pokemon were exposed to an electrical current while holding the item, like traveling through a trading machine, for example, that genetic abnormality would trigger, and they would evolve once again. For a Rhydon, this would change it into a Rhyperior. This stage is massive, even when you compare it to a human. They stand near 8 feet tall, or 2.5 meters, and weigh an incredible 623.5 pounds, which comes out to be 282.8 kilos. That is a massive Pokemon. It has a much rounder body plan than it did before, with orange protective plates covering a lot of its torso, head, and some of its arms. Its arms have also grown and lengthened, now with a hole in the palm that they can use to launch rocks at high speeds like cannons. Its tail also now ends in a large rock-like club, and it now has a smaller horn behind the large central one on its head. Overall, Rhyperior is a massive change to the Pokemon, and that can come with massive requirements to be housed securely. So, let's get into the guide and find out if these Pokemon could possibly be the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Enclosure. These Pokemon have essentially 2 speeds. Grazing, which is a slow walk while they eat the grass around their enclosure, and a charge, which is exactly what it sounds like. They really don't have any in between. Well, at least the first 2 evolutions are like that. Rhyperior, with its smaller legs and heavier bulk, traded in its charging ability for ranged capabilities. It's still a big Pokemon though, and that means that the enclosure that you build for these need to give these Pokemon plenty of space to move and exist in. I couldn't find any hard specific dimensions for the walls of the enclosure, but there are good numbers for the square footage that you'll need. For a Ryhorn, you're looking at 1,500 square feet, or 139.3 square meters. That is a massive space, especially just for one Pokemon. But you have to remember that a big part of Ryhorn's biology is having that ability to run and work their body. Without that, if you put them in an enclosure that's too small for them, then they could end up either not getting the movement they need, leading to a more sedentary and heavier lifestyle, or, in the worst case scenario, it could end up leading to developmental issues if the Pokemon can't get the right amount of exercise. So, even though the enclosure for the smallest of this line takes up more room than the average house or apartment, it's what's needed for them. Thankfully, its evolution Rhydon traded in the quadrupedal form for a bipedal one. This allows it to get more height and thus use its front limbs as hands, but it also means that its charging speed is now lowered. With the lower charging speed, but the bigger size, Rhydon gets an enclosure that is half again as big as its previous evolution, now needing 2,250 square feet, or 209 square meters. And that expands once again once you get to the final evolution of Rhyperior. This follows all the same rules as from Ryhorn to Rhydon. Like we said, it's lost a lot of its charging speed in exchange for the ranged abilities, but it gets much bigger in size as well. Its enclosure only gets bigger by another 500 square feet, bringing the grand total to 2,750 square feet, or 255.4 square meters. In total, a truly massive space that I really don't think that a lot of people will have just lying around just for one Pokemon. And that is just the outdoor enclosure. But we'll get to the indoor enclosure once we finish up with the outdoor part. As for the composition of the outdoor area, let's start with the walls. You want to make sure that the walls are made out of strong and thick concrete, or those large stone blocks that you can set into place and interlock with one another. The walls will need to be at least 6 feet high, though the recommended height for their later evolutions are about 8 feet. That way they have the height and weight to resist things like Rhyperior taking a shot at them. The only difference anywhere on the wall is going to be the gate that you use to enter and leave the enclosure. Due to the immense strength of these Pokemon and their propensity to charge into things, the gate is going to need to be made out of thick, reinforced steel, with multiple locks and reinforcements that'll prevent the Pokemon from just demolishing it. Normally, you wouldn't have to go to these kinds of extremes, but unfortunately, these Pokemon, especially Ryhorn, aren't the brightest tadbulbs in the bunch, so they will at some point slam into the gate at full force, even if they don't mean to. Inside of the enclosure, the majority of the space is going to be open space, allowing for your Pokemon to move and run around the enclosure without too many obstructions. One of the major things that you are going to have to install for them, though, is a mud wallow spot. Since these Pokemon are so large and covered in stone plates, there's a very real chance of them overheating if left in direct sunlight or warm temperatures. But you can't give them a pool of water like you would for other Pokemon, as thanks to their extreme weakness and aversion to water, they would avoid it at all costs. If you provide them with a cool mud wallow to soak in, then they'll use that to avoid the heat. It doesn't need to be too deep, only a few feet at the deepest point for your Pokemon to be able to lay down in. Just be careful if you live in a region that gets cold at any point during the year. When the temperature gets low enough, then the mud will get cold and might even freeze, representing a slipping danger for your Pokemon. Actually, now that I'm talking about it, ice is a very big problem for these Pokemon in general, as if they slip while charging or moving, then they may end up hurting themselves. It's not likely, thanks to how sturdy they are, but it has been known to happen, so do be aware of that if freezing is a concern where you live. Thanks to their ground typing and the fact that these Pokemon do best in places that are either warm or at least temperature controlled, they don't do well in the cold, as I just mentioned. If you live in a place that routinely gets below 40 degrees Fahrenheit, or 4.4 degrees Celsius, then you should provide your Pokemon with an indoor enclosure that it can use to escape the elements. This space can be, thankfully, smaller than the full enclosure, only need to be 100 square feet, 150 square feet, and 200 square feet for Ryhorn, Rhydon, and Rhyperior respectively. That's 9.2 square meters, 13.9 square meters, and 18.5 square meters, respectively. The inside of this should obviously be heated to keep the Pokemon comfortable, and should have some sort of substrate to avoid them sleeping on the hard concrete floor. The substrate can be either hay, wood shavings, or even rubber matting, and a drain should also be installed on the floor to make cleaning easier and assist with any accidents that your Pokemon experience. Keep in mind that this is not designed to be a permanent housing for these Pokemon. So long as the temperature is above freezing, then they should be let out into the wider enclosure for at least an hour or so a couple times a day under your supervision. If you live in an area that is certainly 100% going to be getting below freezing for at least part of the year, then you should be building an indoor enclosure instead of an outdoor enclosure to help these Pokemon avoid the harsh cold. As for other Pokemon that can be housed with them, there really aren't that many. They don't even do well with each other. Males will always be territorial towards each other, no matter how large you make the enclosure, and they don't even do well with females outside of peak mating season. The only way that you can keep multiples of this line together with each other at once is if all of them are female, and even then, it's only in very large enclosures that cover dozens of acres. They get very territorial, and will start to fight and ram with each other over and over again in an effort to drive away the competition. It can easily lead to injury or worse, so it is highly not recommended. And take that idea and then expand it out to every other kind of Pokemon. And you get how these are Pokemon that you're just better off keeping by themselves. Availability. This is another weird one. When you look at the Pokemon and see how it acts normally, you would assume that it would do best in wide open areas, places that are warm and offer spots where the propensity to charge things would be best utilized. And in a few areas, that's exactly what you find. Places like all over Galar, Blush Mountain in Alola, or routes 227 and 214 in Sinnoh, though the last one is a bit colder than the others due to it being in the Sinnoh region and away from Stark Mountain. And, of course, you have the man-made areas where they live in those kinds of environments, like the Safari Zone in Johto and at Blueberry Academy. Even the old Kanto Safari Zone had these Pokemon in a wide-open space, which makes it so baffling that they can also be found in places that make no sense for them. Caves or mountains that don't give them what they should need to be comfortable and happy, yet they persist in living there all the same. Places like multiple different Victory Roads, White Forest in Unova, Cerulean Cave in Kanto, and they even live on Stark Mountain in Sinnoh. It makes no sense. I even asked Dan and Bex about it, and they couldn't think of a reason for it. The best guess that they had was that they had been deliberately introduced to those areas, like with the Safari Zone, to give the trainers that go there a bit more of a challenge. Though, I guess that really only holds up for the Victory Roads? The others... yeah, we have no idea. But if you manage to get to these areas, and are willing to brave the places that these Pokemon call home, then you shouldn't have too much problem finding one. They aren't the most common Pokemon, you'll certainly still have to do a bit of searching for them, but it shouldn't take you too long to find one. The one exception to that is Rhyperior. Thanks to the artificial method that's used to get that evolution, you won't find them in nature. It would take such a weird set of circumstances for that to happen that it's near impossible to find a Rhyperior in the wild. you might actually have better chances of finding one of the pseudo-legends than finding a wild Rhyperior. With the breeding scene, these Pokemon are somewhere in the middle of the availability scale. It takes a bunch of space and time and resources to raise these Pokemon, which, as you all know by now, means there aren't that many people that are willing to invest that kind of capital in a Pokemon that not many people want to have as a home companion. The one saving grace for these guys is the racing scene that I mentioned in the intro to this guide. In places where Ryhorn racing is pretty popular, like in Kalos, you'll find breeders around that are breeding Ryhorn specifically for that. This does unfortunately mean that they charge more because they're high-end Ryhorn, and if you want one of the later evolutions, you'll have to evolve it yourself, but at least you'll be able to find one, unlike regions where the sport isn't as popular. And I guess they do come pre-trained for racing, which, I'll be honest, I have no idea how they do that. Catchability. If you decide to go out and catch one of these guys, then the main thing that you have to keep in mind is that they are oftentimes found in dangerous or hard to get to places. Stark Mountain is an active volcano, so going to it and its surrounding areas is heavily discouraged. There are things like volcanic ash and pockets of poisonous gas that could easily cause you severe harm. And then, you can't even get to any of the victory roads without going through the entire gym badge challenge. And at that point, I'm assuming you have a full regulation team of 6 already. It would be a lot to go through just for you to get a Ryhorn or a Rhydon. That's not to say that they aren't found in safer places, I'm just saying that you should be careful where you go. Your best and safest place to go would be the Johto Safari Zone. It's heavily regulated, and the populations are curated so that the populations stay consistent and mainly of timid and calmer individuals. If you decide to go to one of the other, more wild places, then be sure to keep your head on a swivel. If these Pokemon spot you before you spot them, then you could easily be surprised by a charging rock Pokemon. As well, be sure to bring along a Pokemon of your own to protect yourself. Water and grass types would be the best, as the Ryhorn line are very weak to them, but anything strong enough to handle these Pokemon should work. If you do get in the position to throw a ball at them, your best bet is to go for broke from the beginning and use an Ultra Ball. Or a quick ball if you manage to get the drop on them. Care. Food-wise, these Pokemon are actually fairly easy. Thanks to the digestive system, they eat the same thing as bovine and equine Pokemon. So you're looking at grazing off of hay and grass, supplemented with other things like fruits and veggies. Because these Pokemon are grazers, they'll munch a little bit through the day, so your best bet is to give them a full hay bale somewhere in their enclosure that they can just eat from whenever. You want to make sure that the bale is made of fresher hay, not the super dried out and tough straw, as the latter has no or very little nutritional value anymore. As well, make sure that it's free of things like mold or other pests. If the drying process isn't done correctly, then they can very easily become infested, and it could lead to your Pokemon becoming sick. Then, after you've secured a good supply of hay, you can give them supplemental fruits and veggies in either a dish, or, if you reach this level of training, by hand. For the supplemental stuff, you don't want to give them any more than a kilogram or 2, as it can mess with their digestion and lead to gastrointestinal problems farther down the road. Your Pokemon should eat the entirety of the hay bale in a couple days, but in case they don't, you'll need to get rid of any hay that's become damp or coated with anything like mud or waste. Moving on to training, like I said earlier, I don't know how to train a racing Ryhorn. What I am going to do is give you basic training for these guys so they get used to you being around them and they can interact with you fairly well. But if you decide to try and hop on top of your Ryhorn after just the training that I'm going to outline here, either it's going to think that you're playing with it, which might lead to you getting hurt, or it's going to think that you're attacking it and panic, at which point you are very likely to get hurt. If you want to get into Ryhorn racing, then I highly recommend that you contact someone who is already in that sport and see if you can learn from them. For us, the main goals of our training are going to be getting used to your presence, allowing you to touch the Pokemon, and feeding the Pokemon out of your hand for certain food items. The beginning of the training is going to be fairly sketchy, especially if you get a Pokemon from the wild, as they won't be used to you and there is a good likelihood that they will try to charge you and drive you off. This is why it is highly recommended that you start with Ryhorn, as Rhydon will not just try to charge you, but also swing on you with its new arms and massive tail. And Rhyperior might just start blasting away with its arm cannons. I know it seems semi-counterproductive because I said Ryhorn was the fastest of them when they charged, but it's also the least dangerous of them if they catch up to you. To start, you're going to need a place where you and the Pokemon are in close proximity to each other, but that does not allow you to get smashed by a charge. To that end, you're going to need something called a chute, which, I'll be honest, looks like a torture device. It's a stand of a bunch of industrial metal welded together in such a way to hold the Pokemon still while people work with them. They're oftentimes used on farms for Pokemon such as Tauros. For our purposes, we're going to use it to start the acclimation process. If you can, coax the Pokemon into the chute using some food as encouragement. You could also use its Pokeball for this, in case it's being stubborn, but it's better to have the Pokemon enter the chute of its own accord so it's not startled or panicking so much when you close it in there. From that point, you want to gently interact with it in ways like placing your hands on the Pokemon, speaking to it in a gentle and reassuring manner, and inspecting it for any injury or issues. The entire time, you're going to be positively reinforcing this behavior, feeding the Pokemon treats and helping it form that association of you with good things. Slowly, over time, the Pokemon will grow to be used to you being around it and will not be so cautious when you're nearby, as well as forming that positive connection I mentioned that food comes from you. Mind you, this is going to take a lot longer with Ryhorn than with the other evolutions, as it has a reputation for being not that smart, as well as having a strong stubborn streak in them. The next step is when training is going to be at its most dangerous. You really have to be certain that the acclimation has started to take hold in your Pokemon's mind, because if you try this next step early, then you can easily end up getting seriously hurt. When you are certain that the Pokemon is used to you being around them, then you're going to stop using the chute and get into the enclosure with the Pokemon. It is vitally important throughout this entire step that you, 1. Keep an eye on the Pokemon, 2. Keep its Pokeball on you at all times, and 3. At least in the beginning, don't get too far from the gate. If you see these Pokemon start to charge towards you, then you should get out of there as soon as possible, and if that's not an option, use its Pokeball. Your safety is the most important thing in all of this. If the Pokemon is okay with you existing in the enclosure without charging you, then you should slowly start moving closer to it. Right now, you're just trying to establish how close you can get before the Pokemon becomes uncomfortable. You'll know this when your Pokemon starts turning to face you and then starts swinging its head around, almost like it's showing its horn off to you. At that point, you're going to start bribing with food. Hold out a handful of hay and try to coax them closer with it. They may not approach right away, which in that case, then you should place the food down and back away to a distance when your Pokemon feels comfortable. And from there, you're going to repeat this process day after day. Fair warning, these Pokemon, especially Ryhorn, are very well known for their stubbornness, and again, aren't that bright. So it can take a very long time to get these Pokemon to change their minds about you and start feeling comfortable around you. Eventually, though, you should be able to put the food on the ground closer and closer to your Pokemon, until the Pokemon is able to eat straight out of your hand. At that point, your training is pretty much done. Sure, you could work on petting them and eventually being able to touch them without worry or bribe, but that's really just an extension of what I've already told you. Just remember that sudden movements might startle your Pokemon, and try to avoid any negative interaction between you and them. Something like that could easily set your training back days or even weeks, which is going to be a major pain. One last thing to keep an eye on with the Ryhorn line is to keep an eye on their stone armor, especially with the first two evolutions. With how much these Pokemon use their nose horns to smash into and break through things like trees and stone, there is a very small chance that it can damage their armor. It's not common, as that's what those armored horns are designed for, but occasionally the stone around the horn, or even the horn itself, will crack and chip. If that happens, make the Pokemon Center appointment immediately. If those damaged parts are used after that, there's a chance that your Pokemon could break them even further and cause a major injury to themselves. At the Pokemon Center, they should be able to deal with any cracks or chips before it evolves into a full-fledged injury. Like I said, all of this is a very small chance to happen, but in my research for this guide, I came across some horror stories of this happening, so I wanted to mention it. Cost. There's no two ways about it, this Pokemon is going to be expensive for you to get. Thanks to how much time and effort and resources go into the raising of a breeding population of these Pokemon, I don't see anyone selling them for less than the very high category. I mean, for Arceus' sake, even trying to get one from the wild can be pretty expensive since they tend to live in places that only professional trainers should go to. Either way, you'll be spending a lot of money just to get the Pokemon you want. And that is just for a Ryhorn. For a Rhydon or even a Rhyperior, then you're looking at spending much more. And the enclosure isn't going to be that different. Sure, it's not that complex, but thanks to how the space is set up and how much space these Pokemon need, it's going to be a lot to get things set up correctly. Add in the fact that you'll need an indoor enclosure if your area gets cold at any point in the year, and the stuff you'll need for training, like the chute, and this will easily put you into the very high category. Food is the one place where you can try to save a bit of money with these Pokemon. A bale of hay, even the good, expensive stuff, shouldn't cost you too much. Oftentimes, they're even sold in bulk for bovine and equine Pokemon, so you should be able to get a good deal for that. The most that you're going to spend here is for the supplemental fruits and veggies, but even with that included, I don't see you going above the moderate price per month in this category. Conclusion. I'll admit, I thought these guys were going to be a lot worse than they actually were. After all, when you hear about this line, the first thing that pops into your mind are things about them charging and not stopping, or how stubborn and thick-headed they can be. But I'm pleasantly surprised to say that they aren't that bad. Yes, that reputation is well earned, but they aren't any worse than any other advanced level Pokemon. I would say that these aren't great for beginner trainers, but anyone who has experience raising stubborn Pokemon, or has the patience to train them and has the space for these Pokemon, could easily end up finding out that these are the perfect Pokemon partners for them. Thank you all for listening, and please join us again next time when we talk about the caring, nurse-like Pokemon Happiny and its evolutions Chansey and Blissey. Have a wonderful night, everyone.